The loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful. Think about the meetings you have sat in, the negotiations you have watched, the rooms where decisions actually got made. When you trace the line from conversation to outcome, when you follow the thread from what was said to what actually happened, you often find that the decisive influence did not come from whoever was speaking the most. It came from someone else. Someone who said less, who listened more, who asked one precise question at exactly the right moment and then went quiet again, who was reading the room while everyone else was performing for it. This is the person we are talking about in this audiobook. Not the extrovert who dominates conversation, not the charismatic figure who fills every silence with energy. Not the person who leads with volume and sustains attention through sheer presence. The person we are discussing operates differently. Their influence is harder to trace precisely because it does not announce itself. It does not require an audience. It does not depend on being seen performing leadership in order to produce leadership outcomes. This person observes, accumulates, synthesizes, and then, when the moment is precisely right, they act not with noise but with precision, with one well-placed idea, one quietly framed question, one synthesis that reorganizes how the room understands the problem. And the room shifts. Here is what most people have been taught about influence: that it is a function of personality, that some people have it naturally, the charismatic, the extroverted, the verbally fluent, and others must work around this deficit, must compensate, must push against a natural headwind to achieve what the naturally gregarious get for free. This is not an accurate map of how influence actually works. It is a description of one type of social power, the kind that is immediately visible, the kind that is legible to audiences, the kind that is easy to mistake for the only kind because it is the most obvious kind. Visible power is not the same as effective power. Volume is not the same as authority. The person who talks first does not set the agenda. The person who frames the conclusion does. In the next several hours, you are going to develop a precise understanding of how quiet influence operates, not as a philosophical position on introversion, not as a consolation for people who are uncomfortable speaking, but as a genuine strategic framework, a set of specific, practicable approaches to building real influence in complex systems built on the specific advantages that quieter, more observational modes of operating actually produce. You are going to understand why the capacity to observe accurately gives you information others do not have, why strategic use of silence creates pressure without aggression, why the person who speaks last, rather than first, so often determines what the room concludes, why deep, bilateral listening is one of the most powerful relationship-building tools available, more powerful than charm, more durable than charisma. And you are going to understand how to work in complex systems, how to read patterns in noise, how to move from a position of informed clarity rather than reactive urgency, how to let others exhaust themselves in visible competition while you remain positioned for the moment when considered action actually matters. None of this requires changing who you are. None of it requires that you become more extroverted, more aggressive, more willing to perform confidence you do not feel. It requires something harder and more valuable: precision. The development of deliberate, disciplined practices that convert the natural inclinations of a quieter, more observational mind into strategic assets rather than social liabilities. Your silence is not a weakness you are working around. It is a resource you have not yet fully learned to use. That changes now. Introduction. The myth of loud leadership. There is a story that most organizations tell themselves about leadership. It goes something like this. Leaders speak, they articulate vision. They fill rooms with presence, they are recognized immediately as the person in charge, not because of a title, but because of the energy they project. They do not wait for permission to take up space. They simply take it, confidently, naturally, as though the space was always theirs. This story is not entirely wrong. Some highly effective leaders operate this way. The extroverted, articulate, visibly commanding leader is a real type. They exist, they produce results, and in certain environments, certain cultures, certain industries, certain historical moments, they are exactly what is needed. But the story is incomplete, profoundly and consequentially incomplete, because it conflates a particular style of leadership with leadership itself. It mistakes the performance of authority for the substance of it, and it creates an environment in which people who do not naturally perform authority in that way, people who observe more than they speak, who process before they respond, who build influence through depth rather than breadth, conclude that leadership is simply not for them. This conclusion is wrong, and the evidence against it is substantial. Look carefully at the people who have shaped the outcomes of the most complex situations you know of: business transformations, political negotiations, organizational crises, scientific breakthroughs. Not the people whose names are most visible, not the people whose public presence is largest, but the people whose judgment most consistently produced the right analysis, whose framing most reliably led to productive resolution, whose influence was most durably felt. You will find repeatedly that these people share a particular characteristic. They are not necessarily the most verbally fluent, not the most charismatic, not the first to speak or the most comfortable with an audience. They are the most accurate observers, the most disciplined processors, the most patient strategists, people who understood the situation more completely than those around them, not because they were smarter in some abstract sense, but because they were more systematically attentive, more willing to listen before concluding, more capable of holding ambiguity without prematurely resolving it into false certainty. The quiet strategist is defined not by what they withhold, but by what they accumulate. While others are managing their own presentation, monitoring how they are being perceived, calculating how to position their next contribution, maintaining the performance of competence, the quiet strategist is doing something different. They are attending, observing, gathering information that others, occupied with their own performance, or generating freely. Every conversation is a data field. Every meeting is a set of signals about where people actually stand, what they actually fear, what they want but have not directly stated. The person who is primarily engaged in performing their own competence collects very little of this data. The person who is primarily engaged in observing collects a great deal. And information is the foundation of all genuine strategic advantage. Not information as data points, information as accurate understanding of the actual human landscape: who is aligned with whom, who is uncertain, who is committed to a position they will not publicly defend, who is looking for a direction they will follow if it is offered credibly. The quiet strategist builds this understanding systematically, without announcing it, without performing the observation, simply by directing genuine attention outward rather than inward. There is a second element that defines the quiet strategist. They are comfortable with silence in ways that most people are not. Silence in most social contexts is experienced as a problem, a gap to be filled, an awkwardness to be resolved. When silence falls in a conversation, the natural pressure is to end it, to say something, anything that gets the exchange moving again. This pressure is powerful and nearly universal, and most people most of the time comply with it. The quiet strategist recognizes that this pressure is information. The person who cannot tolerate silence will eventually fill it. What they fill it with tells you something significant about what they are thinking, what they are uncertain about, what they want you to believe. The pause deliberately held is not an awkward void. It is a collection mechanism. And in negotiation, in difficult conversation, in moments of genuine tension, the person who is most comfortable with silence has a structural advantage, because their comfort with it is not something the other person can easily read or respond to. It does not signal confidence or aggression or discomfort. It simply is, and in the absence of readable signal, the other person tends to assume the worst for themselves and reach for resolution that relieves their own discomfort. This audiobook will teach you to use that dynamic deliberately. Not as manipulation in the cynical sense, not as a tool for extracting unfair advantage from people who cannot defend themselves against it, but as a disciplined application of a genuine advantage. The advantage of someone who has developed comfort with silence in contexts where silence is rare, who has developed the patience to observe before concluding, who has developed the precision to speak less and land more. The promise here is specific. By the end of this audiobook, you will have a working understanding of 5 distinct domains of quiet strategic practice. How to observe accurately, how to use minimal speech for maximum impact, how to maintain emotional composure under conditions that destabilize others, how to build durable influence through depth of connection rather than breadth of visibility, and how to navigate complex, ambiguous systems with the advantages that a quieter, more disciplined mind provides. These are not abstract principles, they are specific practices. Each of them can be engaged immediately. Each of them builds on the others, and together they constitute a coherent and powerful approach to influence, one that does not require you to be louder, bolder, or more outwardly commanding than you naturally are. You have been told, in various ways and through various channels, that your quieter orientation is something to work on, something to compensate for, something that holds you back in environments that reward visibility and volume. That framing is not serving you, and it is not accurate. Your quieter orientation, developed with precision and deployed with discipline, is one of the most significant strategic assets available to a person navigating the complexity of modern organizational and social life. The silent strategist is not someone who operates despite their quietness. They operate because of it. Let us build that capability precisely and completely, beginning now. Chapter 1. The Psychology of Active Observation. Most people listen to reply. This is the default mode of attention in most conversations. and it produces a fundamental limitation. You cannot fully attend to what is being said if a significant portion of your cognitive resources is already engaged in constructing your response to it. This is not a character flaw. It is the predictable output of a social environment that rewards rapid, articulate response, where the ability to contribute quickly to a conversation is read as evidence of intelligence and engagement. Where pausing to think before speaking is sometimes interpreted as uncertainty or slowness rather than as the appropriate response to complexity. But the cost of this mode is significant. When you are primarily listening to reply, you are processing the surface content of what is being said, the explicit statements, the direct arguments, the announced positions. You are tracking what is said, but you are largely missing what is not said. The hesitation before a particular word, the slight inconsistency between what is stated and what the body communicates, the way a person's energy shifts when a specific topic is introduced, the gap between the position they are articulating publicly and the uncertainty visible in how they are articulating it. These are the signals that carry the most significant information, and they are only available to someone who is not primarily occupied with constructing their own response. This is the first discipline of the quiet strategist, learning to listen with genuine surplus attention, to take in not just content, but the full behavioral field of the interaction, everything the other person is communicating, not just through their words. Let us be specific about what this observation actually looks like and what it yields. In any conversation, there is a spoken text and a subtext. The spoken text is the explicit content, what the person is saying they think, feel, want, or intend. The subtext is the layer beneath that, what they actually think, feel, want, or intend, which may or may not match the spoken text. Most of the time, in most conversations, these layers are largely aligned. People generally mean approximately what they say. But in situations of any significance, in negotiations, in high-stakes discussions, in conversations where something important is actually at risk, the gap between the spoken text and the subtext widens. People say what they feel safe saying. They do not necessarily say what they most need, most fear, or most want. The person who can read this gap accurately has a significant advantage, not just in knowing something the other person does not realize they have revealed, but in being able to respond to what is actually happening rather than just to what is being announced. Reading this gap requires attention to several specific categories of signal. The first is language choice, the words people select, particularly under pressure. When the careful management of presentation slips slightly tell you something precise about their actual cognitive and emotional state. Notice when someone switches from specific language to vague language on a particular topic. This usually signals either genuine uncertainty or deliberate concealment. Notice when someone uses distancing language about something they are supposedly committed to saying, the plan rather than our plan or my plan, because distance in language often reflects distance in genuine investment. Notice when qualifying language appears that was not present in earlier statements, because qualifications often arrive when confidence is eroding. The second is timing and pace. When does someone slow down? When do they speak slightly faster than their baseline? Slowness often indicates careful management. They are navigating something they find difficult or potentially revealing. Speed often indicates emotional activation. They have moved from deliberate presentation into reactive mode. which is where the most unmanaged information appears. The third is consistency between channels. What someone says with their words is one signal. What their body communicates is another. And what their tone and pace communicate is a third. When these three channels are consistent, when words, body, and tone all point in the same direction, the message is almost certainly genuine. When they are inconsistent, when the words say one thing and the body or tone say another, something is being managed. Something is not quite as presented. This is the domain of what researchers have studied as microexpressions, the brief, involuntary facial movements that precede or accompany more controlled expressions. They are not difficult to detect once you are genuinely attending to them. The slight flicker of something that looks like concern before the composed response. The mere tension around the eyes when a particular topic is mentioned. The controlled quality of a smile that does not quite reach the rest of the face. You do not need specialized training to detect these signals. You need genuine attention and the cognitive availability that comes from not being primarily occupied with your own next statement. There is a specific practice for developing this quality of observation that is worth describing in detail. In any significant conversation, before you enter it, set a specific intention. The intention is not to contribute well or to make my position clear or even to listen carefully in the generic sense. The intention is this: to collect 3 specific observations during this conversation that I did not have before entering it. One about what this person actually wants that they have not directly stated. One about where they are genuinely uncertain even if they are presenting as certain. One about what they are most careful about, what they are managing most deliberately. These 3 observations become your objective, and collecting them structures your attention in a way that generic listening carefully does not. You are not passively open to whatever information arrives. You are actively searching for specific categories of signal. An active search is significantly more effective than passive reception. The mirror effect is the second major tool in the active observation framework, and it operates on a principle that most people do not make explicit to themselves. People talk more when they feel heard. This is a deeply established feature of human social behavior. The feeling of being genuinely understood, of having someone actually track and engage with what you are saying rather than simply waiting for their turn, creates a kind of verbal generosity. People elaborate. They go deeper. They offer context and qualification and personal history that they would not offer to someone who was clearly just waiting to respond. The inverse is also true. People contract when they feel they are performing for an audience rather than engaging with a genuine listener. When they sense that what they are saying is being processed primarily as a position to be countered or a claim to be evaluated rather than as something someone is genuinely trying to understand, they say less. They stick closer to the official position. They disclose less of the actual texture of their thinking. The quiet strategist exploits this dynamic not through deception but through genuine practice. The practice of actually attending, of actually tracking what the other person is saying with full cognitive engagement, produces the conditions under which people give you the most accurate and complete information. Not because you are manipulating them, but because the experience of genuine attention is rare enough that people respond to it with unusual openness. The pause is one of the most powerful specific tools in this repertoire. When someone finishes speaking, the dominant social norm is to respond promptly, to fill the space, to demonstrate engagement through immediacy of response, but a brief pause, 2 to 4 seconds of genuine attention held on what was just said, before you begin to respond to something interesting. It communicates to the other person that you are actually processing what they said, not just waiting for your turn, not just going through the social motion of appearing to listen, actually taking in their communication and giving it genuine consideration before responding. This experience is unusual enough that it typically produces one of two responses. The other person elaborates. They add something to what they just said, some qualification, some additional context, some admission, because the continued attention is an implicit invitation to go deeper. Or they wait, slightly uncertain, and in that waiting they reveal something about what they are actually thinking through the quality of the uncertainty they display. Both of these outcomes are useful. The elaboration gives you more information. The uncertainty in the waiting tells you something about the actual confidence they have in what they just said. The pause is not a trick. It is a disciplined practice of resisting the social pressure to fill silence immediately, a pressure that, when you comply with it, consistently costs you information you would otherwise receive. There is a related and equally important use of the pause as a response to provocative or emotionally loaded statements. When someone says something that you find challenging, upsetting, or genuinely provocative, the natural impulse is to respond quickly, to address the provocation immediately, to demonstrate through speed and directness that you are not affected by it, or that you are capable of handling it. But speed here is almost always the wrong choice. When you respond quickly to provocation, you are responding from a reactive state. The emotional activation that the provocative statement produced has not had time to process. What comes out is not your considered position, it is your immediate, emotionally activated position, and emotionally activated responses, however fluent, however intelligent they might sound, consistently give the other person more information than you intended to provide. They reveal the degree to which the provocation worked. They communicate that you can be moved. The deliberate pause, the held attention, the considered beat before you respond does the opposite. It communicates, without any explicit statement, that you are not in reactive mode, that the provocation registered but did not destabilize, that what is coming is considered rather than reactive. This is not performance, or rather, it is only performance if you are not actually doing the underlying thing. The underlying thing is genuinely taking a beat, genuinely processing what was said before you respond to it, genuinely giving yourself the seconds required to move from emotional activation into considered engagement. The data you collect through active observation is only as valuable as your capacity to synthesize it. Observation that accumulates without integration produces information overload rather than strategic advantage. The discipline, therefore, is not just collection but processing. After significant interactions, the quiet strategist practices a brief review. Not an extensive written analysis, though in high-stakes ongoing situations. Written notes are genuinely useful, but a deliberate mental consolidation. What were the 3 most significant things I noticed? What do they tell me about this person's actual position that is different from their stated position? Where is the gap between what they presented and what I observed? And what does that gap suggest about what they actually need, fear or want? This review, practiced consistently, builds something that is extraordinarily valuable and accurate. increasingly detailed model of the people you work with. Not the official version they present, the professional, managed presentation they maintain for public consumption, but the actual version. The one that includes their genuine uncertainties, their actual priorities, the things they want but are not comfortable asking for directly. With that model, your strategic capacity is entirely different from the person who is working only from official presentations. Because you are not responding to what people say they want, you are responding to what they actually want. And you are able to frame your contributions, your proposals, your responses in ways that address what is actually driving the conversation rather than what is being announced as driving it. This is where the observational advantage converts into real influence, not through knowing more information in some abstract sense, but through understanding the actual human landscape of any given situation with a precision that the people who are busy performing their own positions simply cannot match. Observe more than you speak, not as a passive default, as an active, disciplined, strategic choice. The information you collect will be the foundation of everything that follows. Chapter 2. Strategic honestness, the power of few words. There is a phenomenon that anyone who has spent time in professional environments will recognize, even if they have not named it. The person who speaks constantly, who fills meeting time generously, who contributes to every agenda item, whose voice is a regular presence in group discussions, is often heard less clearly than the person who speaks rarely and precisely. Their individual contributions carry less weight. Their specific observations are harder to isolate and retain, not because they are less intelligent or less knowledgeable, but because frequency dilutes impact. Because when everything is equally present, nothing stands out. The person who speaks rarely and precisely has a different relationship with the room's attention. When they do speak, the attention is qualitatively different. It is more focused, more receptive, more inclined to genuinely engage with what is being said rather than processing it as part of an ongoing stream of input. This is not a natural social dynamic. It is a dynamic that has to be deliberately created and maintained. And it is one of the most underutilized strategic advantages available to the quiet strategist. The weight of a word is not intrinsic to the word. It is a function of context, of expectation, and of scarcity. When you speak rarely, you create scarcity. When you speak with consistent precision, when what you say is almost always relevant, almost always clear, almost always genuinely useful, you establish an expectation. And the combination of scarcity and positive expectation creates a specific kind of attention, anticipatory attention. The room leans in slightly when you begin to speak, because the established pattern suggests that what is coming will be worth the engagement. This anticipatory attention cannot be manufactured through clever technique. It is built through consistent behavior over time, through the accumulation of instances in which your contributions were worth hearing, through the earned reputation for speaking only when you have something that genuinely adds to the conversation. But it can be deliberately built, and the building process is specific. The first discipline is the practice of the withheld contribution. In any group discussion, there are things you think of saying that are relevant, that are correct, that would not be out of place, but that are not the most important thing you could contribute. The discipline is to withhold these contributions. not because they are wrong or unhelpful, but because they are not the single most valuable thing you can offer in this moment. This practice is more demanding than it sounds. The impulse to contribute, to demonstrate engagement, to add your voice to the discussion, to show that you have been tracking the conversation is real and consistent. Resisting it requires a specific, deliberate decision each time. The decision to hold what you have in mind until something better presents itself, or until what you have in mind is clearly the most important thing available. The practical discipline is this: before you speak in any group context, run your intended contribution through a single filter. Is this the most important thing I can add to this conversation right now? Not is this relevant, not is this correct, not is this something I want to contribute, but is this the most important thing? If the answer is no, hold it. Keep observing. Keep collecting. The moment for the most important thing may be coming, and you need to be available for it. When you do speak, when you have determined that this is the moment and this is the contribution, the delivery matters as much as the content. Precision of language is the first requirement. Say exactly what you mean, not approximately, not with the qualifications and hedges that signal uncertainty, not with the elaborate framing that apologizes for taking up space. Exactly what you mean in the fewest words that communicate it completely. This is harder than it sounds. The default for most people in professional contexts is to covert qualify, to signal awareness of complexity, to demonstrate that they know the issue has multiple dimensions before they offer their view on it. These signals have their place, but they dilute the impact of what follows. The person who says, well, it's complicated, and there are obviously a lot of factors here, and I'm not sure I have the full picture, but it seems to me that, has already spent the attention of the room before they have said anything substantive. The person who says precisely and directly what they actually think without the elaborate disclaimers, without the performance of epistemic humility, lands differently. Even if the content is identical, even if the privately held uncertainty is the same, the directness of expression communicates confidence in the conclusion, even when you hold appropriate uncertainty about the path that led there. This is not dishonesty. Confidence in a conclusion is not the same as certainty about everything that supports it. You can be genuinely clear about what you believe while acknowledging privately that the picture is complex. The discipline is to not let private complexity undermine public clarity unnecessarily. When clarity is warranted, and in most professional contexts, most of the time, clarity is warranted, lead with the clear statement. Follow it, if necessary, with qualification. Never lead with the qualification. The structure of a high-impact contribution is position first, then rationale. Not rationale first, building to the position. The attention economy of most group discussions is thin. If you do not claim it immediately with the substance of what you are saying, you risk losing it before you arrive there. The tactic of the final word deserves particular attention because it is one of the most specific and most consistently effective tools in the quiet strategist's repertoire. In most group discussions, there is a natural tendency toward conclusion, a moment when the energy of discussion has begun to wind down, when the various positions have been aired, when people are beginning to feel that something should be summarized or decided. This moment is preceded by a period of diminishing marginal returns where each additional contribution adds less than the previous one, where the conversation is circling rather than advancing. The quiet strategist is watching for this moment. Because whoever speaks at this moment, whoever offers the synthesis, the framing, the statement that captures what the discussion has produced and points toward where it leads has a particular kind of influence. They are not winning an argument. They are not being the most persuasive voice. They are doing something more powerful. They are defining what the conversation was about. The person who frames the conclusion owns the narrative of what was decided and why. They set the terms on which follow-up action will be organized. They have the last clean word before the discussion moves on, which means their framing is what people carry with them when they leave. Executing the final word effectively requires patience and accurate reading of the room's energy. Patience, because you have to resist the impulse to synthesize before the conversation has genuinely run its productive course. If you offer the synthesis too early, you cut off the discussion before it has generated the best information, and you risk appearing presumptuous or controlling rather than considered and authoritative. Accurate reading, because you need to distinguish between the moment when the discussion has produced its best material and is now cycling, versus the moment when it seems like it might be cycling but actually has more useful information to generate if given slightly more space. The skill is in that distinction, and it develops through practice, through the accumulated experience of watching conversations, reading energy, and gradually developing a more reliable sense of when the productive phase has ended. When you have identified the moment, the synthesis itself should do three things. It should acknowledge the strongest points that were made, not all of them, but the strongest 2 or 3. This demonstrates that you have been genuinely tracking the discussion and not simply waiting for your turn. It also creates goodwill with the people whose contributions you acknowledge, which is strategically useful even when it is also simply appropriate. It should integrate those points into a coherent framing, a way of understanding the discussion that gives it structure and direction, not a compromise that splits the difference between opposing positions, but a genuine synthesis that shows how the best elements point towards something. And it should end with clarity about direction, not with an open question, with a statement about where this leads. The delivery of this synthesis is as important as its structure. It should be calm, unhurried, neither tentative nor aggressive, the tone of someone who is not proposing their preferred outcome but simply reporting what the conversation has produced for the room's consideration. This tone, considered, clear, not seeking approval, is what gives the final word its authority. The room does not experience it as someone trying to control the outcome. They experience it as someone offering genuine clarity on what has been muddled. And the relief of clarity, after a period of productive but complex discussion, produces receptivity that no amount of earlier advocacy could generate. There is a related practice worth naming: the strategic question. The strategic question is not a genuine question in the sense of requesting information you do not have. It is a question that is designed to introduce a consideration that you believe is missing from the discussion, but introduced in a way that invites the room to discover it rather than being told it directly. Has anyone considered what this approach implies about how we handle X? Is more effective than I think this approach has a problem with how it handles X. The first invites engagement. It positions you as a facultative intelligence rather than an opposing voice. It creates the conditions for the room to arrive at your concern as their own, which means they are more likely to genuinely engage with it rather than defensively dismiss it. The strategic question is also a more accurate signal of calibrated confidence. It says, I have noticed something that may be important. I am not certain of its significance, but I believe it warrants the room's attention. This is an honest representation of the appropriate epistemic position on most significant questions, and it reads as such as someone with genuine intelligence rather than positional advocacy. There is a final dimension of strategic honestness that is worth examining: the power of not responding. Not every statement requires your response. Not every challenge requires your answer. Not every provocative claim requires your engagement. The quiet strategist practices the discipline of selective engagement, of consciously choosing which invitations to respond to rather than reflexively responding to all of them. Because the ability to choose not to respond is itself a form of power. It communicates, without any explicit statement, that your engagement is not compelled, that you are deciding what is worth your attention rather than being pulled by every conversational current. This is particularly important in response to provocation statements designed to elicit a defensive or explanatory response from you. The person who has learned to not reflexively respond to provocation has removed one of the most reliable levers others use to control the direction of a conversation. When you do not take the bait, you force the other person to work harder, to make their actual point more explicitly, to deal with the fact that their provocation did not produce the expected effect. This is uncomfortable for most people to practice. The social pressure to respond when addressed, to engage when your contribution is implicitly or explicitly invited, is powerful. Not responding feels rude. It feels like an avoidance or a retreat. But there is a distinction between avoidance and deliberate non-engagement. Avoidance is reactive. It is driven by the discomfort of the engagement. Deliberate non-engagement is a choice driven by the assessment that the engagement is not worth your time or would not serve the conversation productively. The distinction is visible in how it is carried. The person who avoids engagement looks uncomfortable. The person who deliberately chooses not to engage looks composed. The first signals that the provocation worked on some level. The second signals that it did not. Practice the non-response in small, low-stakes moments. First, when someone says something that could invite your pushback, but that is not genuinely worth the energy, hold the response. Observe what happens. Notice how the absence of your engagement redirects the conversation, often in ways that are ultimately more useful than your engagement would have been. You speak rarely, you speak precisely. You synthesize at the moment of maximum impact. You ask questions that introduce considerations without positioning you as an opponent. And you choose deliberately what to engage with and what to let pass. This is the practice of strategic honestness. And over time, consistently applied, it builds something that volume of speech can never build: the reputation of someone whose words carry weight. Not because you have convinced people that your words are valuable, because you have demonstrated it repeatedly through the accumulated quality of what you have said and what you have chosen not to say. That reputation is one of the most durable forms of influence available. It does not require maintenance through continued high performance. Once established, it creates anticipatory attention that makes your actual contributions more effective than they would otherwise be. The quieter you are willing to be, the more your words will land when you choose to speak them. Use this deliberately. Use it consistently. Use it as the strategic asset it actually is. Chapter 3: Emotional Sovereignty. There is a quality that distinguishes the people who lead effectively through genuinely difficult situations from those who lead effectively only when circumstances are favorable. It is not intelligence, it is not experience, though experience contributes. It is not even good judgment in the abstract, though good judgment is its product. The distinguishing quality is composure, the capacity to maintain a functional, considered internal state under conditions of genuine pressure, genuine uncertainty, and genuine provocation. To continue thinking clearly when the situation is designed either by circumstance or by other people to make clear thinking difficult. This quality has a name that is sometimes used loosely in ways that dilute its meaning. Call it emotional sovereignty, the condition in which your internal state is primarily governed by your own deliberate engagement with your circumstances rather than by the circumstances themselves, where your emotional response is something you have genuine agency over, rather than something that is automatically produced by external events. The strategic value of emotional sovereignty is not primarily self-referential. It is not mainly about how you feel. It is about what it communicates and what it makes possible. What it communicates, composure under pressure, is one of the most powerful signals of genuine authority that exists, not because it looks impressive, though it does, but because it is rare. And because its rarity makes it immediately legible as something that was built rather than simply possessed. People who remain composed when everything around them is producing pressure are not pretending the pressure is not there. They are demonstrating that the pressure cannot determine their response. This demonstration is received, at a largely non-conscious level, as evidence of reliable judgment. The person who loses composure in a crisis is, in that moment, communicating that their judgment has been compromised by the emotional intensity of the situation. The person who maintains composure is communicating that their judgment is still available. And in a crisis, available judgment is the most valuable resource in the room. What composure makes possible? Most strategic errors in high-pressure situations are made not from lack of knowledge or lack of intelligence, but from the narrowing of cognitive capacity that emotional activation produces. When the pressure is high and the emotional intensity is real, the range of options you can see contracts. The tendency toward confirmation bias increases. You look for information that supports what your emotional state is already inclined toward. The capacity for nuanced assessment, for holding complexity, for genuinely weighing competing considerations degrades. The person who can maintain composure through this process, who can feel the pressure without having their cognitive capacity significantly narrowed by it, has access to more of their intelligence at the moments when intelligence is most needed. This is a direct, practical, strategic advantage, not an abstract virtue, a concrete capability that produces better decisions at higher stakes moments. The practice of imperviousness, of maintaining a composed external presentation under pressure, is often misunderstood as a kind of emotional suppression, as though the composed person is simply not feeling what others feel, or is refusing to acknowledge it. This is not accurate. The composed person is typically feeling everything that the situation produces. The pressure is real to them. The stakes are real. The provocation, if there is one, registers. What is different is the relationship between feeling and behavior. For most people, The chain from feeling to behavioral expression is short and largely automatic. They feel provoked and they show provocation. They feel pressured and they show pressure. They feel uncertain and they show uncertainty. This is not a failure of character, it is simply the default human mode of functioning, in which internal states translate into external behavior without significant deliberate management of the transition. For the emotionally sovereign person, the chain is longer. There is more distance between what is felt and what is expressed, not because feeling is suppressed, but because behavior has been decoupled from feeling at the automatic level. What gets expressed is the result of a choice, even a very rapid choice, even a choice made in real time under genuine pressure rather than the unmediated output of the emotional state. This distance is what is built through practice, not through the suppression of feeling, which produces its own problems and is ultimately not sustainable, but through the development of a different, more deliberate relationship between internal experience and behavioral expression. The practical core of this practice is what might be called the 10-second delay. Not literally 10 seconds in every case. In many situations, even 2 or 3 seconds is sufficient. But the deliberate practice of creating any gap between the arrival of a provocative or pressure-generating stimulus and your behavioral response to it. Here is what happens neurologically in that gap. The initial response to a provocative or high-pressure stimulus is generated by systems in the brain that are optimized for rapid response. Systems evolved for dealing with immediate threats where speed of response matters more than quality of judgment. These systems produce the impulse to respond quickly, to defend, to attack, to flee, or to freeze. But these are not the systems you want running your professional and social decisions. Those systems, the ones optimized for rapid threat response, do not have access to your full intelligence. They operate with a narrow, fast, and often inaccurate model of the situation. The 10-second delay gives the more recently evolved, more capable but slower cognitive systems time to engage. The systems that can hold complexity, that can assess a situation with more than one variable, that can consider consequences, that can distinguish between what is actually threatening and what merely feels threatening because it is uncomfortable or unfamiliar. In that gap in the deliberate, practice space between stimulus and response, you move from the reactive to the considered. And the considered response, even under significant pressure, is almost always more strategically effective than the reactive one. The practice is this: when something occurs that generates an impulse to respond immediately, an aggressive comment, a provocative claim, an unexpected challenge, a situation that makes the internal pressure spike, you do not act on the first impulse. You hold it for the few seconds required to let the initial reactive activation subside slightly and the more considered processing engage. This hold is not avoidance. You are not running from the situation. You are not pretending it did not happen. You are simply creating the space in which your most capable cognitive systems can engage with it rather than your most reactive ones. And during that hold, you are also observing, because the way a person responds to the absence of your immediate reaction tells you something useful about their actual confidence in the position they just expressed. The person who provokes and then waits with evident composure for your response is genuinely confident. The person who provokes and then immediately fills the silence, elaborating, qualifying, softening, justifying, is not. The 10-second delay does double duty. It gives you access to your own best judgment, and it creates a brief observation window in which the other person often reveals something important about their actual position. The concept of the unreadable face is worth discussing here, because it is one of the most practical tools of emotional sovereignty in high-stakes interactions. In most professional contexts, much of the strategic information flows through emotional display. You can read how the room is reacting to a presentation through the expressions of the people in it. You can gauge the strength of someone's position through how much tension appears in their face when it is challenged. You can assess where the genuine decision-maker in a negotiation stands by watching which arguments produce visible engagement and which are received with flatness. This information flow is bidirectional. Your expressions are also being read. The tension in your face when a particular issue is raised is information. The flicker of uncertainty when a challenge lands. The slight visible increase in energy when something goes your way. These signals are being read, whether or not you are conscious of generating them. The quiet strategist manages this output, not through the stiff, artificial blankness of someone trying to be unreadable through suppression, but through the genuine composure that is the natural product of a regulated internal state. When you are not in reactive mode, when the 10-second delay has moved you from the emotional to the considered, what your face displays is not suppressed emotion. It is the genuine expression of someone who is thinking. Thinking faces are harder to read than reactive faces. They are less predictable. They generate less information for the person trying to assess your position or your vulnerability. And the uncertainty that the other person feels when they cannot read you is itself strategically useful. It tends to produce more information-sharing behavior on their part as they attempt to elicit a clearer signal. The aura of what some might call imperviousness, the quality of someone who cannot easily be rattled, is not primarily about how you look. It is about the absence of easily readable reactive expressions. And that absence is the natural consequence of a genuinely regulated internal state, not of skilled acting. This is why the practice of emotional sovereignty produces real strategic value rather than just the appearance of it. Because the genuine actual composure, actual regulated internal state, actual considered response rather than reactive one produces the external signals naturally. You cannot fake the aura of someone who is genuinely unrattled for any sustained period. But you can build the actual capability, and when you have it, the aura follows. There is a particular situation that tests emotional sovereignty more severely than most: the public challenge. The public challenge is when someone calls your position, your reasoning, or your competence into question in a context where others can observe the interaction. It may be in a meeting, in a group negotiation, in any setting where the audience is present and the challenge is designed, explicitly or implicitly, to put you on the defensive. The public challenge is a specific power move. Its strategic purpose is not primarily to win the argument. Its purpose is to put you in reactive mode, to get you to respond defensively, emotionally, or at length, because all of these responses communicate that the challenge worked, that it found something, that you are not as composed or as secure in your position as your presentation had suggested. The way to handle the public challenge is counterintuitive. You do not meet its energy. You do not escalate. You do not defend at length. You do not perform composure through stiff formality. You respond with genuine calm, at normal volume, with an answer that is shorter than the challenge, and then you stop. The shortness of the response is the key element, because a long response to a challenge signals that the challenge required a long response, that it raised a genuinely significant issue that needed substantial addressing. Even if the long response is persuasive, it concedes ground by its length alone. A short, clear, calm response signals the opposite. It signals that the challenge, while noted, did not require extensive defense, that the position is secure enough to need only a brief clarification, that you are not in the business of performing your confidence, you simply are, to the appropriate degree, confident. This approach is sometimes described as not taking the bait, but it is more precise than that. Taking the bait means engaging with the emotional energy of the challenge. The discipline is to engage with the substantive content, to respond to the actual question or concern, but to do so without absorbing the emotional charge that came with it. This is the most demanding application of emotional sovereignty. It requires that you are genuinely regulated at the moment the challenge arrives, that you have enough of an established practice of 10-second delays and considered responses that the public challenge does not catch you entirely in reactive mode. Which is why the practice cannot be saved for high-stakes situations alone. It must be the consistent practice in low-stakes situations, in ordinary conversations, in minor disagreements, in situations where the pressure is low enough that the practice is comfortable. Because the degree to which the considered response is available under high pressure is determined by how deeply the practice is embedded through low-pressure repetition. The composure you need in the board meeting is built in the small frustrations of ordinary days. The ability to hold the considered response under genuine public pressure is built by the many unremarkable moments in which you could have reacted but chose instead to pause and think. There is one more dimension of emotional sovereignty that deserves specific attention: the management of success. Most of the attention given to emotional regulation focuses on the management of negative states, provocation, pressure, disappointment, but the composed person also manages the positive states, because visible cover-creation to success is as revealing as visible cover-creation to setback. It shows that your emotional state is highly reactive to outcomes, which means it is highly dependent on external events for its quality. The person who receives good news with the same measured quality they bring to difficult news is communicating something important: that their internal stability is not primarily weather vanes to outcomes, that they are not relief-seeking or validation-seeking at a structural level, that the positive and negative alike are received with genuine equanimity. This evenness is not coldness. Genuine pleasure at a good outcome is appropriate and human, but the degree to which it is visible, the degree to which it communicates how much you needed the good outcome, is something the composed person regulates, not to hide genuine satisfaction, but to ensure that satisfaction, however genuine, does not betray the degree to which your internal state has been hostage to the external result. Emotional sovereignty, in its full expression, is the quality of someone who is genuinely self-governing, not governed by their circumstances, not governed by others' provocations or assessments, not governed by the requirement that outcomes be good in order for internal stability to be maintained. This self-governance is built, practice by practice, delay by delay, considered response by considered response. It does not arrive complete. It develops through consistent engagement with the specific practices described here. And as it develops, The quality of your engagement in high-pressure situations transforms, not because the pressure decreases, but because your relationship to it changes, because the pressure, however real, no longer has direct access to your behavioral output, because there is now a thinking, choosing self in the space between stimulus and response. That space is where your best work lives. Defend it, expand it, inhabit it fully. Chapter 4: Hidden Influence and the Soft Power Principle. The most durable forms of influence are invisible. This is not an observation about deception. It is an observation about how human cognition and social behavior actually work. The ideas that people are most committed to the directions they pursue with genuine investment rather than reluctant compliance are the ones they believe they arrived at themselves, not the ones that were delivered to them from authority, not the ones they were persuaded into through argumentation, the ones that feel like their own conclusions. This is a feature of how human beings relate to their own agency. We are motivated by what we choose. We are activated by what we own. We comply often grudgingly with what is imposed, but we pursue with genuine engagement what we have decided. The quiet strategist understands this and builds their approach to influence accordingly, not through the imposition of their perspective through force of argument or positional authority, but through the careful creation of conditions in which others arrive at their own version of the strategist's conclusion and pursue it with the energy of genuine personal commitment. The practice of seeding ideas, of introducing a thought into a conversation or a context in a way that allows it to develop organically in the other person's thinking, is one of the most sophisticated and most effective forms of influence available. It begins with a principle that sounds simple but requires genuine discipline to execute. Do not deliver your conclusion. Deliver the consideration that naturally leads to your conclusion, and allow the other person to take the final step themselves. This is a fundamental departure from the default mode of influence, which is direct argument. I believe X, here is why X is true, therefore you should accept X. Direct argument is sometimes necessary and sometimes effective, but it reliably activates a cognitive mechanism that limits its effectiveness, the tendency to evaluate the credibility and agenda of the source before evaluating the content of the claim. When you make a direct argument for your position, the other person's first move is not to consider whether your position is correct. It is to ask, why is this person making this argument? What do they gain from my agreement? How does this position serve their interests? And once that evaluation begins, the argument is being processed through a filter of skepticism rather than genuine open consideration. The seeded idea bypasses this filter. When you introduce a consideration, I've been thinking about what happens to the timeline if the first phase takes longer than expected. You are not making an argument. You are raising a question. And questions, unlike arguments, do not activate the readability and agenda filter. They are simply interesting or not interesting, worth following or not worth following. If the consideration is genuinely important, the other person follows it. They think about what happens if the first phase takes longer. They arrive at the implications themselves. And the implications, the conclusion, is now something they discovered rather than something you told them, which means it is something they own. And ownership, as noted, drives a fundamentally different quality of engagement than compliance does. The seeding process has several specific forms that are worth distinguishing. The most basic is the question that contains an implicit framing. Has anyone looked carefully at the third-party implications of this? Does not assert that there are significant third-party implications, but it introduces the category third-party implications into the room's active consideration. And once introduced, the category tends to be pursued, because not pursuing it begins to feel like an oversight. The slightly more advanced form is what might be called the partial disclosure. You share a relevant piece of information without the interpretation or conclusion you have already drawn from it and allow the other person to draw their own conclusion. We've been tracking X, and the trend over the last quarter is interesting. You have shared the fact that the trend exists. You have described it as interesting, which implies it is worth attending to. But you have not told them what the trend means or what they should conclude from it. The genuinely curious among them will ask, and when they ask, they are actively seeking the information rather than being the passive recipient of it. The same information, actively sought rather than passively received, is processed more deeply, retained more reliably, and acted on with more genuine investment. There is an important ethical dimension to the seeding of ideas that deserves explicit acknowledgement. A power of this practice lies in the fact that it bypasses the other person's defensive filter against direct persuasion. This bypassing can be used to help people arrive at genuinely good conclusions they might otherwise have been too defensive to consider. And it can be used to steer people toward conclusions that serve your interests but are not necessarily in theirs. The distinction matters. The quiet strategist's power is only sustainable and only genuinely admirable when it is used in service of outcomes that are defensible by the standards of everyone involved. The moment this practice is used primarily to manipulate people into serving your interests at their expense, it ceases to be strategy and becomes a form of exploitation that, over time, erodes the trust and relational capital on which all genuine long-term influence depends. Use this practice in service of the best available outcome, with genuine regard for what that means for everyone involved, not as a limit on what is possible, but as the standard that makes your influence genuinely durable. The second major domain of this chapter is the building of alliances through deep listening, and it deserves examination in its own right, separate from the observation practices described in Chapter 1. Because what we are discussing here is not primarily about collecting information, though information is collected. It is about something more fundamental: the creation of genuine relational depth with specific individuals, through the specific practice of making them feel genuinely known. The feeling of being genuinely known is rare. Most interactions in professional contexts are characterized by a form of mutual performance, both parties presenting managed versions of themselves, both parties attending to the interaction with divided attention, both parties primarily concerned with their own contribution rather than with genuinely understanding the other person. Against this background, the experience of being with someone who is genuinely attending, who is actually tracking your thinking, who asks questions that demonstrate they heard what you said 5 minutes ago, who notices what is significant to you and treats it as significant, stands out sharply, memorably. And the relational effect of that experience is substantial. People who feel genuinely known tend to feel genuine goodwill toward the person who has generated that experience. They feel understood in a way that creates loyalty, not the commanded loyalty of obligation, but the chosen loyalty of genuine affiliation, the sense that this person actually gets me. And with that sense comes a natural inclination to be on their side, to help them when help is possible, to support their positions even when other options are available. This is the quietest power of deep listening, not as a manipulation to extract favor, but as the genuine effect of actually attending to another person with full and generous engagement. The practice is specific. In one-on-one conversations with people whose alliance matters, whether for a current project, a longer-term relationship, or a genuinely valued connection, you direct your full attention to actually understanding them, not just their stated position on the relevant topic, but what they actually care about, what genuinely concerns them, what they are proud of, what they want, what they find genuinely interesting. You demonstrate this understanding not through elaborate paraphrasing or performative reflection, but through the quality of your subsequent questions. The question that picks up exactly where they left off. The question that shows you heard what they emphasized, not just what they said loudest. The question that follows the thread they were pulling on and gives them space to pull it further. These questions communicate more powerfully than any explicit statement that you have been genuinely present, and that genuine presence, sustained across a conversation, produces an experience of being heard that most people encounter rarely. The person who has experienced this with you carries that experience. It shapes how they think about you. It creates an implicit sense that you see them clearly, which, in a world where most people feel substantially unseen in their professional lives, is a powerful bond. There is a specific technique within deep listening that is particularly effective for building the recall of specific details across time. When you remember and reference something specific that someone told you in a previous conversation, you communicate something beyond the content of the reference. You communicate that the conversation mattered enough to be retained, that you were genuinely present for it, that they are significant enough to be in your memory at that level of specificity. Most people do not remember these details about their colleagues and collaborators, not because they are incapable of it, but because they were not genuinely present enough during the original conversation for the specific details to be encoded. The person who can say, weeks or months later, "How did this situation you mentioned with your counterpart resolve?" has demonstrated the kind of attention that generates genuine loyalty. This is not a memory trick. It is the natural product of actually listening, of being genuinely present in the original conversation rather than performing attention while primarily attending to your own next contribution. The alliance network that develops through the practice of deep listening is qualitatively different from the alliance network developed through visibility and volume. It is smaller, the relationships are fewer but substantially deeper, and that depth produces a kind of reliable support that the broadly visible person's network often cannot match. The broadly visible person has many acquaintances, people who know them at the level of professional recognition, who have a generally positive impression of their competence. These people will support the broadly visible person in ways that cost them little. They will agree publicly with positions the broadly visible person has taken. They will speak positively about them when asked. They will give them the benefit of the doubt when reputation is at stake. But when something genuinely difficult is at the table, when supporting your position requires someone to take a risk, to spend some of their own credibility or goodwill, to stand up in a context where standing up has a cost, the shallow network of acquaintances is thin. The person who has invested in deep bilateral relationships has built something different. The people in their inner circle have a genuinely felt connection to them. Not the diffuse goodwill of recognition, but the specific loyalty of genuine affiliation. And that loyalty is what shows up when the support required has a real cost. Build a deeper network, not through visible social investment, through attending events, through the performance of relationship building, but through the disciplined practice of genuine bilateral attention, one conversation at a time. Each conversation in which you give another person the genuine experience of being fully heard is an investment in a relationship that will compound over time in ways that are difficult to predict but consistently valuable. The scale is not the goal, the depth is. A small number of relationships characterized by genuine mutual understanding and genuine mutual investment is worth more than a large network of superficial professional acquaintances. Because when things get hard, and they will, depth is what holds. The hidden influence of the quiet strategist does not look like influence from the outside. It does not come with announcements or visible power moves. It operates through the ideas people believe are their own and the relationships they experience as genuine and valued. This is why it is durable. Power that announces itself invites resistance. Power that works through genuine understanding and genuine connection invites the opposite. It invites the kind of willing, engaged collaboration that produces the best outcomes for everyone involved. That is the goal, not invisible control, invisible effectiveness. The influence that doesn't need to be seen to be real. Chapter 5. The advantage in complex systems. Complexity is increasing. This is one of the reliable features of the current organizational and social environment. The problems that matter most, the decisions that carry genuine consequence, are characterized by more variables, more interdependencies, more genuinely uncertain feedback loops than they were a decade ago. The world that human organizational systems are navigating is simply more complex than the world those systems were designed for. This creates a specific and interesting dynamic, because not everyone responds equally well to genuine complexity. And the people who respond most poorly to it, the people who are most likely to produce errors under conditions of genuine systemic ambiguity, are often not the least intelligent or least experienced. They are the people who most need certainty, who are most uncomfortable with the feeling of not knowing, who are most inclined to resolve complexity prematurely, to simplify it into something manageable before it has been understood, because the discomfort of holding genuine uncertainty is greater than the discomfort of operating on a possibly incorrect simplification. The quiet mind has an advantage here. This is not a generalization about all quiet people or all extroverts. It is an observation about the specific cognitive mode that the practices described throughout this audiobook develop and reinforce. The practice of observing rather than reacting develops tolerance for ambiguity, the capacity to hold open questions without prematurely closing them. The practice of strategic honestness develops the habit of considering what the most significant signal is among many signals before responding. The practice of emotional sovereignty develops the capacity to maintain cognitive function under the pressure that complex situations generate. Each of these practices, developed in the interpersonal and social context of previous chapters, applies with equal force in the domain of systems thinking. And in complex systems, these capacities translate into specific, concrete advantages. The first is pattern recognition. Complex systems generate enormous amounts of information, more information than any individual can process consciously. But not all of this information is equally significant. Some of it is noise, random variation that carries no meaningful signal about the underlying system. Some of it is signal, the patterns that reveal how the system actually behaves, where its leverage points are, how it is likely to respond to different interventions. The critical skill in complex systems is distinguishing signal from noise. And this distinction is not made through more intensive analysis of more data. It is made through a calibrated attention that knows which categories of signal matter for the specific question at hand. The reactive person in a complex system applies their attention broadly, and equally they attend to whatever is most visible, most recent, most emotionally salient. This produces a lot of data but not necessarily a lot of signal. Because visibility, currency, and emotional salience are not reliable indicators of significance. They are indicators of accessibility, which is a different thing entirely. The deliberate observer applies their attention selectively, in accordance with a prior understanding of what kinds of signals carry information about the questions that matter. Not what is happening in the general sense, but what is happening in the specific categories that matter for the specific question I am trying to understand. This is the advantage of the informed prior, the question-specific framework that guides attention toward signal and away from noise. And it is a skill that develops through the accumulated experience of having paid close attention over time, having noticed what proved significant and what did not, and having gradually refined the framework through which attention is directed. The quiet strategist's habit of observing more and speaking less, the practice of attending rather than performing, builds this framework continuously. Every conversation, every meeting, every interaction in which genuine attention is directed outward rather than inward adds to the database from which pattern recognition emerges. There is a specific cognitive phenomenon worth understanding here: the difference between searching for patterns and allowing patterns to emerge. The person under pressure in a complex system typically enters a state of active pattern searching. They are looking for the answer, scanning intensively for whatever signal will resolve the ambiguity and allow a decision. This intensive search, while intuitively appealing, often reduces the quality of pattern recognition, because intensive active search tends to confirm whatever framework the searcher already holds. It finds patterns consistent with prior assumptions and overlooks patterns that don't fit them. The more effective approach, counterintuitive in high-pressure moments, but consistently more accurate, is deliberate attentional rest. Not inattention, not disengagement, but a less tightly focused mode of attention that allows the full perceptual field to be processed at once, without the narrowing that intensive search produces. This is the state in which significant patterns are most reliably noticed, not through forcing the seeing, but through creating the cognitive conditions in which seeing becomes available. The shower insight, the peripheral idea that arrives when you stop looking directly at the problem. These are not mystical. They are the products of a less tightly focused attentional mode, making connections that intensive narrow focus was preventing. The quiet strategist's default cognitive mode attentive but not reactive, present but not straining is closer to this productive attentional rest than the default mode of the reactive, performance-oriented mind. This is a genuine structural advantage in complex environments where the most significant patterns are not always the most visible ones. The second advantage in complex systems is what might be called the patience of deferred action. In complex systems, there are many moments that appear to demand immediate response but do not actually require it. Many apparent urgencies that are, on closer examination, not genuinely urgent, they are simply uncomfortable. Many pressures to decide before the picture is clear, generated not by genuine temporal constraints, but by the social discomfort of uncertainty, and by other people's desire to have the ambiguity resolved. The reactive person in a complex system is susceptible to these apparent urgencies. They take action before the situation is well understood because the pressure to act, the social and psychological pressure of appearing to be on top of things, of avoiding the appearance of hesitation, is greater than the discomfort of moving prematurely. The patient strategist can tolerate the appearance of inaction when inaction is actually the right move, because the discipline of strategic consciousness, the practice of withholding contribution until the most important thing is clear, translates directly into the discipline of strategic patience. The willingness to hold a position of observation and analysis until the moment when action is most needed and most effective. This patience is not passivity. It is not indecision or avoidance of commitment. It is the deliberate choice to remain in observation mode until the picture is clear enough that action can be taken with genuine accuracy rather than reactive urgency. And in complex systems, the person who acts with genuine accuracy, from a position of well-developed understanding, consistently outperforms the person who acted first. Because first-mover advantage in complex systems is often an illusion. The first to act in a situation that is not yet well understood is often the first to make the error that others learn from. The person who acts second or third, having learned from the first mover's mistake and from the additional information that the developing situation has produced, acts with significantly more accuracy. There is a specific strategic position in organizational and social systems that the patient, observational strategist regularly occupies, the position of the person who sees what is coming before it arrives. This is not premonition. It is the product of sustained, accurate observation over time. The person who has been genuinely attending to a system, to its patterns, to its dynamics, to the developing trajectories of its key relationships and tensions, accumulates an understanding of the system that allows them to project forward with accuracy that looks, from the outside, like remarkable foresight. In organizational contexts, this appears as the person who saw the crisis coming before anyone else acknowledged it, who raised the issue that, in retrospect, was the central one, who identified the risk that everyone else was too focused on short-term pressures to notice. In competitive contexts, this appears as the person who knew where the competition was heading before the competition got there, who had positioned correctly not through luck but through the patient analysis of available signals that others were present for but not attending to. This is the competitive advantage of the quiet mind in complex systems, not the advantage of faster thinking, though precision often produces speed as a byproduct. The advantage of more accurate thinking, of seeing the actual pattern rather than the most visible one. of acting from a position of genuine understanding rather than from the position of someone who could no longer tolerate the discomfort of not acting. Acting from the shadows is a phrase sometimes associated with manipulation or concealment. In the context of the quiet strategist, it means something more straightforward, being willing to let the visible, reactive participants in a situation exhaust themselves and commit themselves to positions, to actions, to investments of credibility before you make your decisive move. The exhaustion of reactive participants in a complex situation is a genuinely useful strategic event, because the reactive participant who has committed early, has advocated publicly for a position, and has invested their credibility in a particular direction, is now constrained. They cannot easily change course without the visible cost of having been wrong. Their commitment publicly made is also a trap, a limit on their flexibility. The person who has remained observational, who has participated in the discussion, who has contributed precision without committing position, who has remained genuinely open to the information the developing situation is providing, retains their flexibility. They can respond to what the situation is actually producing rather than defending the prediction they made before the situation was well understood. And when the moment arrives for decisive action, when the picture is clear, when the alternatives have been reduced by the development of events, when the person who acts now will act with the maximum accuracy and the maximum leverage, the patient strategist acts. Not dramatically, not with announcement, with the specific, precise intervention that the developed situation makes most effective. This is what it means to find the decisive moment in complex systems, not the moment of most activity, not the moment of most pressure, the moment when your specific, well-developed understanding of the actual situation allows you to move with maximum accuracy at minimum cost. In chess, the analogy is the endgame position, where every move is forced, where the long, patient process of piece development and positional play has produced a configuration in which the winning move is nearly inevitable, waiting only to be executed. The quiet strategist builds their way to these configurations through patient observation, through disciplined restraint of premature action, through the accumulation of positional advantage that does not announce itself until the decisive moment makes it apparent. You are building toward this kind of strategic position in every complex situation you navigate. Not always successfully. Complexity is genuinely complex, and no framework eliminates uncertainty entirely, but with the consistent application of the disciplines described throughout this audiobook, more consistently, more accurately, more effectively than the reactive, volume-driven approaches that dominate most organizations and most competitions. The quiet mind is built for complexity, not despite its quietness, because of it. Because the tolerance for ambiguity that quiet patience develops is exactly what complexity requires. Because the attentional discipline that observational practice builds is exactly what pattern recognition in noisy environments demands. Because the strategic patience that emotional sovereignty makes possible is exactly what allows you to wait for the moment when action will be most effective rather than acting when the social pressure is highest. The complex world rewards precision, and precision is what this entire framework builds. Use it in the next complex situation you face. Practice the patience of deferred action. Let others commit while you observe. Let the picture develop before you decide. And when the moment of genuine clarity arrives, act with the full accuracy of everything you have seen. The decisive move, made at the right moment, is worth 10 moves made in reactive urgency before the situation is understood. Trust the discipline, trust the observation, trust the patience, and then act precisely, completely, without hesitation. Closing. Your silence is your shield and your sword. You have moved through the full framework of the quiet strategist, not as a set of techniques to be applied mechanically, but as a coherent way of operating, a way of being in organizational and social systems that converts what most environments treat as a liability into one of the most durable forms of strategic advantage available. Let us bring it together, not as a summary, but as a consolidation, a final pressing of what has been learned into the shape of what you now carry with you. You now understand that observation is active, not passive. That the person who is genuinely attending, who is tracking not just what is said, but how it is said. When the pace changes, when the language shifts, when the body and the words diverge, is collecting information that the performing, advocating, reactive participants around them are not. That this information is the foundation of all genuine strategic accuracy, and that the capacity to collect it is built through the consistent practice of attending more than you present. The data you collect through this attention is not just interesting. It is operational. It tells you where people actually stand, distinct from where they are presenting themselves as standing. It tells you what they genuinely need, distinct from what they are requesting. It tells you where the genuine leverage in a situation actually is, distinct from where the visible action is concentrated. This is a different map of every situation you are in, a more accurate one, and accuracy is the beginning of everything effective. You now understand that your words carry weight in direct proportion to their scarcity and their precision. That the investment in strategic silence and withholding contributions that are not the most important contribution is an investment in the impact of the contributions you do make. That the final word, offered from a position of genuine synthesis after genuine listening, reorganizes how the room understands the situation in ways that no amount of earlier advocacy could achieve. You understand that asking the right question is often more powerful than providing the right answer. That the question that introduces a consideration opens the room to arrive at the implication themselves, and that when they do, their commitment to the implication is of a qualitatively different order than the commitment produced by direct persuasion. And you understand that selective non-response, the deliberate choice to let certain invitations pass unanswered, is not avoidance or weakness. It is the exercise of genuine agency over what receives your engagement. The person who responds to everything is predictably controllable. The person who chooses what to respond to is not. You now understand that composure is not a natural gift some people have. It is a practiced capacity that develops through the accumulated experience of creating space between stimulus and response. That the 10-second delay, the deliberate, practiced pause before reaction, is not a technique for appearing calm. It is the mechanism through which your most capable cognitive systems are given the time to engage rather than leaving the response to your most reactive ones. You understand that the unreadable face is not a performance. It is the natural expression of a genuinely regulated internal state. That the aura of someone who cannot be rattled is the product of being someone who has developed genuine equanimity, not someone who has learned to look equanimous while internally in turmoil. And you understand that this composure, maintained consistently, is one of the most significant signals of reliable judgment in high-pressure situations. Not because it looks impressive, but because it communicates accurately that your decision-making capacity is still available when others is being compromised by the emotional intensity of the situation. You now understand that the most durable influence does not announce itself. That ideas pursued with genuine commitment are ideas people believe they arrived at themselves. That the practice of seeding, of introducing the consideration that leads naturally to your conclusion, rather than the conclusion itself, bypasses the defensive filter that direct persuasion activates and produces a qualitatively different quality of commitment in the people who follow the consideration to its natural end. You understand that deep bilateral listening builds something that visibility and volume cannot. Genuine, chosen loyalty, the alliance of someone who feels genuinely known, who experiences the rare quality of being with a person who actually attends to what they are saying rather than waiting to respond. This loyalty, when it exists, is what shows up when the support required has a genuine cost. And that is when it matters most. You now understand that quiet patience is a structural advantage in complex systems. That the tolerance for ambiguity, the capacity to hold an unresolved picture without prematurely simplifying it, allows for pattern recognition that the urgency-driven, pressure-reactive mind consistently misses. That the person who can afford to let the situation develop before committing retains a flexibility that the early committer has permanently surrendered. And that the decisive action, taken at the right moment from a position of genuine accumulated understanding, routinely outperforms the reactive action taken under pressure before the situation is understood. This is the full picture of what you carry from this audiobook. 5 interconnected domains of practice, building on each other, together constituting a coherent approach to influence and effectiveness that is not only available to quieter, more observational modes of operating, it is optimized for them. But understanding is not the same as practice, and practice is not the same as mastery. The framework has value only to the degree that you engage with it in the actual texture of your days, in the actual meetings, conversations, negotiations, and complex decisions that constitute the environment you operate in. So here is the specific invitation, as concrete as it can be made. In the next 24 hours, choose one practice from this framework. Not all of them. 1. The one that is most relevant to what you are actually facing in the next day. If you have a significant conversation or meeting coming up, practice the 3 observation intention. Before you enter, commit to collecting 3 specific things. 1 about what the other person actually wants that they have not stated. 1 about where they are genuinely uncertain even if presenting as certain. 1 about what they are managing most carefully. Let the intention structure your attention throughout. If you have a situation in which you have been speaking more than is strategically useful, practice the withheld contribution. Identify, before the conversation, the single most important thing you could contribute, and withhold everything else in favor of that one thing. If you are facing a situation that generates significant pressure or provocation, practice the 10-second delay. Before you respond to any stimulus that generates a clear impulse to react, hold it for at least 2 seconds. Let the initial activation subside enough for the considered response to engage. If you are navigating a complex situation with significant uncertainty, practice the patience of deferred action. Identify specifically what you would need to know or see before acting would be genuinely well-timed, and hold the action until those conditions are met, regardless of the social pressure to move before they are. 1. Practice 24 hours, done with genuine attention and genuine engagement rather than as a performance. The results of a single day's practice will not be dramatic, but they will be real. The small shift in your attention during a conversation, the slightly different quality of what you notice, the brief but genuine gap between stimulus and response that you create where before there was none, the withholding of the comment you would have made, replaced by nothing, and the observation of what the silence produces. These small, real shifts compound over days, over months, over the accumulated practice of a career. The quiet strategist is not built in an afternoon. They are built through consistent engagement with specific practices, over sufficient time for the practices to become the default mode of operating rather than the deliberate alternative to it. You are beginning that building, are continuing it. If this framework has named practices you have already been developing without a framework. There is one final thing worth saying, directly and clearly. The myth with which this audiobook began, the myth that influence requires volume, that leadership requires visible, commanding presence, that quiet people operate at an inherent disadvantage in environments that reward these qualities, is not just inaccurate. It is actively misleading. It points people away from developing the actual capabilities that produce actual influence. It valorizes a particular style of social performance while treating the underlying substance of strategic intelligence, relational depth, and disciplined composure as secondary. You are not secondary. Your capacity to observe accurately while others are performing is not a consolation for not being able to perform. It is a distinct and superior strategic capability for environments where accurate understanding of the actual situation matters more than impressive presentation of a preferred one. Your capacity to speak rarely and precisely, to wait for the synthesis, to ask the question that opens rather than the argument that closes, is not the absence of confidence. It is a more disciplined form of confidence than the person who speaks first and loudest can demonstrate, because it is the confidence of someone who trusts their position enough not to need to announce it continuously. Your capacity to maintain composure when others cannot, to continue thinking clearly when the situation is generating pressure that compromises others' thinking, is not emotional distance. It is the product of a genuine practice of internal self-governance that produces better decisions at the moments that matter most. And your natural orientation toward depth over breadth, toward the one relationship of genuine mutual understanding over the 10 relationships of surface visibility, is not a social limitation. It is the foundation of the alliances that hold when the support required has a genuine cost. These are your assets, not despite the quieter orientation you bring to the world, because of it. The question now is only whether you use them with the deliberateness and precision they deserve. Your silence is your shield. It protects you from the reactive mistakes that urgency produces. It makes you unreadable when being read would cost you. It creates the space in which your most capable thinking happens. Your silence is your sword. in the deliberate pause that extracts information from the other person before you respond, in the withheld contribution that gives weight to the one you do make, in the patience that lets you wait for the moment of maximum effectiveness while others exhaust themselves in premature action, in the synthesis that reframes what the room understands at precisely the right moment. Carry both. Use them with precision. Use them with discipline. Use them in service of outcomes that are genuinely worth producing. You are quieter than the room in every room you enter. That is not a problem to be managed. That is the position. Use it.